Throughout history, civilizations have risen to remarkable heights, only to decline over generations. What separates those that endured from those that faded is often not dramatic catastrophe, but something more subtle: the strength and flexibility of their underlying structures. When we examine societies that persisted through centuries of challenge, we find common patterns. They maintained institutions capable of adapting to change. They distributed resources in ways that prevented dangerous imbalances. They preserved systems for resolving disputes, maintaining infrastructure, and responding to environmental stress. Structure encompasses the networks of trust, the mechanisms of governance, and the capacity to absorb disruption without fracturing. Consider the opposite trajectory. Historical evidence indicates that many civilizations began their decline not with invasion or natural disaster, but with the gradual erosion of these fundamental structures. Administrative systems grew too complex to manage effectively. Economic networks became rigid, unable to adjust when trade routes shifted or resources diminished. Social institutions lost legitimacy as they failed to address the needs of broader populations. The Maya city-states of the classic period offer insight into this process. Research points to a combination of environmental pressure and political fragmentation. As populations grew, agricultural demands intensified. Evidence suggests increasing deforestation and soil erosion over decades. Meanwhile, competition between city-states consumed resources without producing stability. No single drought or conflict ended Maya civilization, but the accumulation of stresses weakened the structures that held communities together. By the 9th century, many major centers were abandoned. The Western Roman Empire presents another example of structural decline. Historians suggest that by the 4th and 5th centuries, the empire faced mounting challenges. Defense costs escalated, currency debasement undermined economic confidence, and tax collection became increasingly difficult. The central administration struggled to coordinate responses across vast distances. When Germanic groups moved into imperial territory, they often filled vacuums left by retreating Roman authority. The process unfolded over generations, not in a single catastrophic moment. These patterns reveal an important principle. Civilizations do not typically collapse because they lack resources or face external threats. Rather, decline accelerates when structures lose the capacity to manage complexity, when institutions become too inflexible to adapt, or when the costs of maintaining systems exceed their benefits. The Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor, demonstrated how infrastructure itself can become a source of vulnerability. The civilization engineered elaborate water management systems to support agriculture and urban populations. For centuries, these structures enabled prosperity. But evidence indicates that when climate patterns shifted, bringing unpredictable monsoons, the hydraulic network became difficult to maintain. As the system degraded, agricultural productivity declined and populations dispersed. The very structure that had enabled Angkor's rise contributed to its gradual abandonment. This relationship between structure and resilience appears across different contexts. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest built sophisticated communities in challenging environments. Archaeological research suggests that during the 13th century, several factors converged. Prolonged drought reduced agricultural yields, deforestation eliminated fuel sources, and social tensions increased. The structures that had worked during stable periods could not absorb compounding stresses. What these examples share is timing. Decline happens slowly, often invisibly to those experiencing it. A harvest fails, but next year recovers. A trade route shifts, but alternatives exist. An institution loses credibility, but inertia sustains it. Only in retrospect do we see how small fractures accumulated into fundamental weakness. Adaptability emerges as perhaps the most critical structural feature. Societies that maintained diverse economies proved more resilient than those dependent on single resources. Political systems that allowed flexibility weathered transitions better than rigid hierarchies. Communities that preserved knowledge and technical skills could rebuild after disruption. The Bronze Age collapse of the 12th century BCE illustrates this principle on a regional scale. Within decades, multiple civilizations around the eastern Mediterranean experienced severe disruption. Historians suggest a cascade of interconnected failures. Drought, earthquakes, migrations, and conflicts combined to overwhelm systems that had become deeply interdependent. Societies structured around centralized control had limited capacity to function when those centers failed. The collapse was not uniform, but rigid palatial systems proved especially vulnerable. This brings us to a sobering recognition. The very features that enable civilizations to achieve great complexity, specialization, centralization, extensive trade, can also create fragility. As systems become more interconnected and optimized, they may lose redundancy. When disruption comes, there are fewer alternatives, less capacity to absorb shock. Yet history also shows that decline is not inevitable. Some civilizations reformed their structures in response to crisis. They simplified administration, redistributed authority, or adapted technologies. The capacity for structural change often determined whether societies recovered or continued declining. Understanding how civilizations fail through structural weakness offers perspective on our own challenges. We inherit systems built under different circumstances, facing different pressures. The question is not whether our structures will face stress. They will, but whether they retain the flexibility to adapt, the diversity to remain resilient, and the legitimacy to maintain cohesion when tested. The civilizations we have discussed did not vanish because their people lacked intelligence or will. They declined because structures that once worked became inadequate for changed circumstances, and the capacity to reform those structures proved insufficient. This gradual process, driven by accumulated pressures rather than single catastrophic events, appears throughout the historical record. It reminds us that survival depends not only on what we build, but on our willingness to recognize when those structures no longer serve their purpose, and our ability to reshape them before fragility becomes fracture.